Today, I'm going to respond to some questions about some very famous cases in the history of bioethics called the Baby Doe cases. But before I begin, I want to just mention something that it's hard to convey now the intensity of which the national media covered some of these cases. Like the Karen Quinlan case for 2 years, later the Cruzan case about a woman in a coma, Terry Schiavo case captivated the media for about 15 years. Dolly's cloning was for years. And these cases we're going to talk about today, the Baby Doe cases, about 10 years, the media was pretty intensively covering them. So what started it? Well, it was basically 1971 when two famous doctors, pediatric intensivists at Yale, Duff and Campbell, published in the New England Journal of Medicine that they had deliberately allowed 40 very disabled infants to die in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. That was pretty controversial because basically they were saying, in their opinion, they were better off dead. That later became really controversial. It actually gave rise to a disabled group which called itself Not Dead Yet in reply to that idea. About the same time, down the Atlantic seaboard a bit at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, there were 3 cases of Down's babies born with intestinal obstructions, which often happens. They often also have heart defects. The doctors let the parents decide whether to operate and fix a condition that was life-threatening. In one case, the infant had duodenal atresia, the lack of an opening between the duodenum and the stomach, and if there wasn't an opening, the infant would starve to death and die. So in 2 of the cases, the parents actually let the Down's baby die. In another case, they initially would go let the baby die, and the staff talked to them, and they eventually changed their mind. There was an operation, and the baby lived. There was actually a really famous film about this that Eunice Shriver Kennedy financed called Who Shall Survive? You can actually watch it on YouTube. It kind of dramatizes these cases from the point of view of a resident in the nursery who felt very burdened by this decision. And you can tell emotionally he disagreed with it. And in the movie, it takes 14 days for the baby to die, probably because the nurses are secretly hydrating it at night. Anyway, and afterwards, there's actually a discussion by some fairly famous people in bioethics, like John Fletcher, the bioethicist from UVA who grew up in Birmingham, Renee Fox, a famous medical sociologist, Sidney Callahan, the wife of Dan Callahan, the bioethicist, a really good discussion. This is the background for what happened around 1981 in Indiana. There was another Down's baby. This was basically called the infant Doe case, where an infant with tracheoesophageal fistula, that is a hole that needed to be repaired for the infant to live. And the obstetrician told the parents, better off not to fix it, to let it die, because people with Downs were, quote, mere blobs. Someone disagreed with that and reported the case to Child Services in Indiana. There was going to be a hearing, but before the hearing that occurred, the baby died because the parents basically didn't follow the advice and didn't operate. Years later, in 1986, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission cited this case as a paradigm of unjustified discrimination against people with Down syndrome. That is the background for what happens next. Well, what happens next is that Ronald Reagan is elected president, and he appoints a person named C. Everett Koop as his Surgeon General. Now, C. Everett Koop was pretty famous. He wrote a book called Whatever Happened to a Human Life. He was very aggressive in treating all kinds of infants who needed surgery, and he disagreed with any idea of not treating people with Down syndrome. He and the Attorney General, Ed Meese, did something that was very creative. They basically reinterpreted existing law to get what they wanted. And this happens all the time. So Congress had already passed a law that said you can't discriminate against handicapped Americans, or it's a federal crime. So what Koop and Meese did is they reinterpreted this to mean non-treatment of a disabled infant counted as federal discrimination against a handicapped American. Congress never intended that, but this was a new interpretation. And as a result of this, neonatal intensive care units in major medical centers, like Birmingham, had posters up and said, if you suspect your child is not being aggressively treated, call this 800 number and we will investigate. There were something called Baby Doe squads, which could come at a moment's notice and swoop into your neonatal intensive care unit and demand to see all the records, almost like a sudden bank audit or a straw is suspected. It's very controversial because people working in these units thought of themselves as saving babies. They often work for preemies. They might have to keep them 3 or 4 months to get them up to normal. They very much resented being seen as baby killers. This was all very, very controversial. So what happens next? Well, this all sets the stage for the famous case of Baby Jane Doe. Baby Jane Doe was born in 1983 on Stony Brook, Long Island, Stony Brook Hospital. She had a whole bunch of problems. She had spina bifida, a neural tube defect, basically a hole in her spine where often people were paralyzed below the hole. She had water on the brain, hydrocephalus. She had microcephaly, allegedly a very tiny brain. She had kidney problems. The pediatric neurologist, George Newman, told the parents that because of the microcephaly, she would never have any kind of cognitive development. She would never have any kind of meaningful relationship with the parents. And so don't shunt the hydrocephalus, just let her die. Surgeon there disagreed. He wanted to shunt the hydrocephalus, and he thought if this hydrocephalus was shunted, the brain might grow larger. At this point, the parents agreed with the neurologist and elected not to operate. Also at this point, a local reporter, not a medical reporter, not a reporter for a major newspaper, but from the Long Island paper called Newsday, wrote up this story, and it quickly became a national story. A disability advocate in Vermont, 100 miles north of Stony Brook, filed suit in federal court saying that the non-treatment of Baby Jane Doe violated the Baby Doe rules and was discrimination against a handicapped American. Well, a court said that he didn't have standing to sue, so it tossed him out, but it appointed a guardian ad litem for Baby Jane Doe, that is, friend of the patient, of the client. And his name was William Weber, and he was inclined to respect the decision of the parents until he read the chart. And when he read the chart, he read that the neurologist had written that the baby's head was of a certain size, and that size fell within normal parameters. So it really wasn't microcephaly, and given the hydrocephalus, maybe the brain would get larger if it was shunted. So he actually recommended treatment for the baby. This blew up in the national media, where some people said the parents have a right to make this decision, and the government should stay out of it. Surgeon General Koop, who saw him as an advocate for disabled infants, said, I just want to see the chart. The hospital doubled down and said, we want to protect the privacy of the couple. We don't want to reveal the chart. Well, they may have had also an ulterior motive because they didn't want to reveal that the neurologist had contradicted himself in what he told to the parents. So the case went up on 2 different levels. One, can the records be made public? And secondly, do the parents have a right to make a decision between medically reasonable options? Ultimately, the Supreme Court heard the case and decided Stony Brook did not have to release the records protecting patient privacy. But in the meantime, the parents had changed their mind, had allowed the hydrocephalus to be shunted, kind of like in the Baby Doe case of Johns Hopkins. 5 months after her birth, at 20, whose real name was Carrie Lynn, went home. One of the things I do is I follow up these cases, sometimes a year, 5, 10, 30 years, and I have followed up this case. At first, at 20, it had a lot of problems. She had a lot of operations. She kind of put in a full body cast for a while. Her urinary infections were frequently treated. But eventually she went home. She had 3 sisters and 2 parents. Eventually she ends up going to a special school. At 20, I saw a picture of her and her family. And at 30, I saw a story of her that she was picked up each day to go to a special home for people with disabilities. She liked to play checkers. She had interactions with her sisters. It seems like, she had some kind of meaningful life. That's the last I heard of Carrie Lynn, 30 years after her birth. After this, something really monumental happened. In 1992, Congress really finalized a lot of these developments by passing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1992. Now, this basically said that not aggressively treating disabled babies or adults and giving them access and giving them accommodations was a violation of federal law. That really changed a lot of things. And one of the things this shows is the power of the disability advocates and their advocacy. Inside medicine, what's happened is controversial because this is kind of the paradox we're left with. If you test a fetus in the first or second trimester for a chromosomal defect like Downs or a neural tube defects like spina bifida, you can abort. Many, many couples who test do abort, try again for a normal child. And one study I read years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, 90% of couples who get a result of Downs elect to abort. On the other hand, once the child is born, we're not back in the 70s where doctors give the parents the right, oh, do you want this child to live? Should we operate? They pretty much have to operate, or they're guilty of violating federal law and discriminating against handicapped Americans. The legacy of Baby Jane Doe and the Baby Doe cases is mixed. Not everybody is happy with the results. There are pediatricians who follow some of these cases for years. Some families are miserable. Some families rally around the disabled person, and it's the highlight of their life, kind of mainstreaming an adult with Downs, but very controversial case. Anyway, that's the story of the Baby Doe cases and how they riveted the country. I'd like to hear what you think about this. If you think parents should have more rights to choose, if you think maybe some parents are prejudiced against disabled people, give me a comment. And if you like the story, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, ring the bell. Thank you.